Not again, not again, not again. Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Madelyn Detloff about Queer Bloomsbury. Now, Madelyn Detloff is the editor of this volume, or co-editor of this volume, Queer Bloomsbury with Brenda Helt, and is also the author of The Persistence of Modernism and The Value of Virginia Woolf. So this session was recorded as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group's regular meetup. If you're based in Brighton, you can join them in person. And if you're not based in Brighton, you can also join us via Zoom. Please check out our website at www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Instagram or Twitter. I think that's all I've got to say for now, so I'm going to hand over to Madelyn and the rest of the group.
Great big thank you to Madelyn for joining us. I've been reading through some of your books. If people here want to have a look at The Value of Virginia Woolf, The Persistence of Modernism, on loss and trauma in the 20th century, and Queer Bloomsbury, which is an anthology of lots of essays on the topic. And they're all really, really fascinating, really brilliant books to sort of engage with. And I thought we'd sort of start off with something about the term itself, queer. So I've sort of been thinking recently about the word queer, how the word queer conjures up numerous images and associations in my head. Some of them might sort of be contradictory and they're not always consistent. So when I was in university, for example, in sort of the early 2000s, one of the lecturers said if we were looking for sort of mainstream examples, Graham Norton would be gay and Marilyn Manson would be queer, because Marilyn Manson was sort of deliberately subverting signs and norms of gender, while Norton was simply attracted to people of the same sex. On the one hand, I have a kind of association in my head with sort of countercultural subversion of gender and social norms. It's really good that we've got Yasmin here today, because I also have this other idea who's involved with Against Equality and is one of the founders of Against Equality. And in that context, I think of queer revolution as something that might be contrasted to sort of mere inclusion within the military, within marriage and so on. I also think of it in terms of a phrase of sort of reclaiming language, but I also think of it in terms of queer theory. Immediately, people like Foucault and Butler come into my mind. And then sometimes I also think of it in terms of a sort of an umbrella term for people who are LGBTIQ, etc. So given that this word can be used in multiple ways and not all consistent ways, how do you personally approach and think about the word?
Thank you. And thanks, Bradley, and all of you for inviting me here. This is a really great idea. And I wish I were hanging out in the bar with you right now. I'm sorry I'm across the world right now. But this is really a great example of conviviality. So it makes me pretty happy. Queer. So what I want to say is that when we get into questions of definition, we should also ask ourselves why we're doing that. And I don't mean of you, Bradley, but of some of the arguments that get thrown around about definitions having to do with identity. And sometimes the motivation behind it, whatever's behind the question, has to do with setting boundaries around an inclusive and an exclusive group. And I'm wary of that. Just remember, I'm probably a couple generations older than you all. So, there used to be questions of who is a real X? What's a real lesbian, right? And there was all sorts of biphobia and transphobia involved in that. That's not the only part of the story, but it's one part of the story. And so as somebody who sort of grew up with queer theory and came in on the in the early end of it, where Butler and Eve Sedgwick were very new, was in grad school, and the term hadn't been around, and then suddenly it was. I really think of queer as something as a verb, right, or maybe an adjective. And I stray away from thinking of queer as, a marker of identity, even though it is used often as an umbrella term. I try to stay away from that when I can, because queering something is often making it more difficult or questioning sort of stable identity groups, not to just unaffirm somebody who might be claiming that identity group, but to think about the relationality between embodiment and desire, sex, right? All these things are, for me, relational in a way that makes it hard to sort of pin it down. And then once you pin something down, you start building walls around who is in and who is not in. So when I think of queer, when I teach queer theory, I think of it as a verb, right? So queering something. So Marilyn Manson might be queering what it means to be embodied as feminine or something like that. Does that make sense? So it's or an adjective, Bloomsbury is a group that Brenda Helt and I and our contributors, think of as a queer group, or a group that can be looked at in order to sort of extract queer principles, right? So that's the adjectival thinking on that. I also wanted to think about, rather than the question, which is the one that's identity boundary policing, it's like, is that queer? Isn't that queer? Is she a lesbian or isn't she a lesbian? Which again, that's back from the early 80s. Start using, instead of the to be verb is, use journalist questions, right? So when is it queer? Journalist questions are the ones who, when, why, what, where, for whom, how. So how is it queer? So at any moment when you ask a question about something that's queer, then you follow it up with, how is Marilyn Manson queer? Under what conditions? Under what conditions can we think about people who aren't traditionally identified under the L, the G, the B, the T, or the I, or the A, right? All of those letters that add to the acronym might be doing something or living in a way that is queer, right? The non-normative force of the term is really important for me, and the idea that we're not as interested in a sort of fixed identity, because that fixed identity has so often been the problem for people who are sort of placed under the sign LGBTQ plus. So I hope that's a slight answer to your question. I could talk about this for another 2 hours, but I know you have more questions.
No, that's really great. Thank you. So in your co-authored introduction to Queer Bloomsbury, you tell us that you think a separation between the two words queer and Bloomsbury are impossible. In light of this, who were the Bloomsbury Group, and in what respect can we understand them as queer?
Cool, and that's a great question. So the Bloomsbury Group tends to be known as early 20th century group of artists and thinkers, writers, who hung out in Bloomsbury, which at the time was not as posh as other parts of London, and a little more, and I think that's probably still what we think of with Bloomsbury, although I think you would know more than I, but the sort of academic status of Bloomsbury now pushes it a little more towards a sort of elite status. But people like Virginia Woolf, who is the person I write about most, and her sister Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant, and David Garnett, and Duncan and David and Vanessa Bell were in a relationship, what we would call today a sort of polyamorous relationship together. Woolf herself was, married to Leonard Woolf, but also in relationship, physical, but then also I think you could say epistolary with Vita Sackville West, and had lots of what she would call sapphic, inclinations. Who else did I say? Maynard Keynes, Desmond MacCarthy. So a number of Quentin Bell, who was Clive Bell. So a number of these thinkers who roughly hung out together in their early years, in their 20s, having things like dinner parties, or having a group like what you have, where people got together to talk about ideas, maybe read a little something of a story or a poem or autobiographical memoir that they've done. They're often very funny, witty, and went on to, I think, make some fairly innovative strides in the art world and in culture. Woolf was a modernist writer who I think really pushed the boundaries of the traditional form of the novel. Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell and the folks in the Charleston farmhouse at the time did some really amazing work through the Omega Workshop. And they also lived together in Charleston as conscientious objectors, right? And so the farmhouse became a place where people could object to the militarism of World War I. And they continued to, I think, have this wonderful interchange between and among each other to continue to think through the pressing issues of the day, both aesthetically and intellectually, morally, ethically, politically. And they fed on each other in really productive ways, right? So that's Bloomsbury. That's my definition of Bloomsbury. There are detractors of Bloomsbury. We could talk about that later, but those folks tend to think of it as an elitist sort of aesthetic group. And we'll talk about what kinds of heteronormative thought went into those characterizations of Bloomsbury or those misunderstandings. But from my perspective and from Brenda Helt's perspective and the writers in this anthology, it was a really generative place and opportunity to gather, right? And so that's what I think of as Bloomsbury. Now, the question of queer and Bloomsbury together, I could talk more about that, but I think when we think about queer as non-normative, right? And the idea that a sort of heteronormative family situation, a heteronormative temporality to your life, right? A heteronormative adherence to both gender and sexual mores and norms, that all of these things have a kind of idealistic lockstep to them, right? So you wind up, and nobody really is truly following the entire lockstep, entailment of heteronormative cultural intelligibility that's following Butler. But there's this sense that we all have to judge ourselves by that, or not. We can just say, fuck that, I'm good, and that's mostly what a lot of queer folks do, or people who identify with queer theory and action and movements would say, well, that's a destructive pressure on somebody to be and act and do a certain way. So, but those strictures, what I called following Butler, the heteronormative logic of cultural intelligibility, they do more than say, you can fuck this person and you can't fuck that person. In fact, in a lot of heteronormative situations, it's not really the sex that's the problem. It's the things that go along with intimacy with other people, right? So as long as you're homophobic but you happen to have, sex with somebody in a fraternity or the Navy or something like that, then, that can be forgiven, as it were, more easily than having intimacy or avowing, desire for somebody, right? It's about how much you want to go along with those strictures about, heteronormative family relations and relationships to the state, etc. Following from that, I think Bloomsbury, the folks in Bloomsbury did not adhere to the idea that, relationships should be, in these monogamous pairings, right? Or that women should be a certain way and men should be another way. There are limits to their own thinking that we can talk about. Like today, 100 years later, we might be like, well, you haven't, you're really thinking about women and men, and there are people who identify as non-binary or identify in different ways. So that's not like Bloomsbury had it all figured out, but I think they can show us a way that we can be together, live together, connect together beyond this very narrow notion of family and a family, a man and a woman who get married and supposedly have monogamous sex with each other for all the rest of their lives and pop out 2 or 3 children. Right? That, wasn't the standard mode of living and being for the folks in Bloomsbury, even if they did happen to, pop out a child or 2, or some of them happen to be married. But there were also so many other ways of being and being together and being intimate and being in the same space and being physical or tender with each other, and think through the idea of pleasure as something that is generative, maybe ethically good, right? It's hard to think of one of the main, sort of people associated with Bloomsbury as a group, who wasn't sort of fucking with the heteronormative sort of logic of cultural intelligibility. And so that's why I think when we think of Bloomsbury, the queer is redundant, right? I mean, Bloomsbury Group was already doing or practicing queer modes of being and living, whether or not we put the term on it, whether or not we say queer, and it has less to do with who they were fucking and more to do with, how they were living, as it were.
In the introduction to Queer Bloomsbury, you write that conviviality, living together, feasting together, thinking and debating together, and developing lasting, intimate friendships thus form the core value of Bloomsbury life and culture. Sexual intimacy between friends of either gender was not only accepted, but understood as a rich source of intellectual, artistic, and philosophical affinity among the group. In what ways are these forms of living together and creating together central to an understanding of this group, their art, and their ideas?
Yeah, I think it just answered some of that, but I think when you look at, for example, the Omega Group, right? And so if you go to look at Charleston Farmhouse, they made their paintings and the craft work, if I can say that in a way that doesn't devalue craft, that they lived in it. Right. And so if you look at their fireplaces and their screens and their plates and, the architecture and the landscape, that it was all sort of saturated their creative work, right? And they lived in it and among it. So I think that is, I'm not an art historian, but I think that is something that is distinctive about the Bloomsbury Group insofar as that they really, they had a collective, right? The Omega Collective, and then they did all sorts of interesting work, like textile work, and that they were really collapsing the boundary, I think, between, sort of art and craft in a way that it was really interesting, or the domestic and the domestic and the public, right? So you wouldn't necessarily be making an artwork so that it can be like shown in a museum, but it's something that you could sit on, a chair. For example. So I think the idea of conviviality, which I really think is important because it's a lot harder to dehumanize somebody when they're sitting across the table eating a burrito with you or something, right? I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it becomes a lot harder. And those connections you get from being neighbors or cohabitants or partners at table really, they open up other avenues for understanding each other. So conviviality is, I think, really important politically or ethically. The Bloomsbury Group, I think they lived that, sometimes imperfectly, and they could be shitty people too. I mean, when you think about a friend group, not everyone is perfect at all times, right? But then if you're in a friend group, you can call out a friend, or you can, forgive them, or you can understand them. It's like, okay, Madelyn's having a bad day, so we'll let her rant a little bit, right? So that conviviality, I think, is really key to the kind of art they made and the philosophy that they generated, and let's just say the practices or habits of being that they emulated, and that comes out in their writing and their art, and then they're also in stuff like the economics of someone like Keynes, right? Maybe in this sort of mid-COVID time, these pandemic times, we're discovering a little more how important it is to live alongside each other or abide with each other, and how necessary that is, either because we're missing that or because we've relied on that to get us through, and we've had to invent different ways to sort of come together, like over Zoom, or parties out on the back porch with, a fire pit going and everyone huddled in a blanket. So there's things we can learn from those modes of being, and we shouldn't necessarily discount modes of being together that are nonverbal or not articulated in prose and put in a book or on a film as somehow less important than the published things. They might be more important because they're everyday, right? And they impact us. Our everyday practices impact us in ways that we don't always recognize, but that are profound.
Why you are so interested in the Bloomsbury Group in comparison to other things that were going on. When the talk was announced and I was having to think about it, the Bloomsbury Group seems to be sort of very tied to a lot of the philosophy that's going around in the UK, which is like positivism and sort of like scientific kind of enlightenment thought in a lot of ways. To the salons in France, or some of the discussions that were going on in Germany, why is it about the Bloomsbury Group, which is more obscure and perhaps a little bit more, in the philosophical side, comes from that sort of British Enlightenment tradition makes it interesting.
Thank you very much for that question. And there's not a conceptual reason for that. I mean, I came to the Queer Bloomsbury from the perspective of queer theory and literature, and I wrote about Virginia Woolf in my dissertation, and I started really, you write about one author in particular. I also wrote about Gertrude Stein and Hilda Doolittle, and you could look at the sort of living community that Hilda Doolittle and Breyer, what I think was called Kenwyn, their living community too is a certain kind of queer convivial space. So I don't think Queer Bloomsbury or Bloomsbury is the, epitome of this sort of convivial queer space. I think it's an example of it, but I got kind of interested in putting together the anthology in part because Brenda Helt, who not here, but who is really in some ways the moving force behind getting this anthology together. She was very interested in doing it, and we needed to bridge a gap between the academic world and the non-academic world. And so I helped bridge the academic part, and she's an artist. Actually, you can look up her work, and she has a PhD. She's done a lot of thinking about this, but it's sort of a moment of irritation for her and a lot of scholars, of people like Woolf, that there was this sort of caricature of the Bloomsbury Group and their kinds of thinking, especially Woolf. I'll just be honest that that's my entree into it, but also Keynes and Forster, people like that. There was a kind of negativity focused on the Bloomsbury Group by people like F.R. Leavis and Q.D. Leavis and later scholars who were kind of Carolyn Halburn, especially in the volume that we edited, wrote an early piece about how much homophobia had to do with how, especially homophobia against gay men, or men who slept with men is probably a better term because I don't know how they identified, led to this kind of discounting or aversion towards thinking about the Bloomsbury Group as people who had sort of generative and maybe even interesting ideas that we might emulate if we wanted to sort of create a more ethically spacious world, that we could all live in without the sort of pressures of or the strictures of heteronormativity. It's a circular trip I took you on, but the point is, both Brenda and I were at a point where we both were kind of frustrated by the caricature, and so we looked at it again from the perspective of queer theory and anti-homophobic, anti-heteronormative theories to see, like, first of all, the past scholarship on Bloomsbury and how a lot of that had been swept aside, and then brought that back to the fore. So this is partly a reclamation project, but then we invited sort of newer ways to think about Bloomsbury that was centered in queer theory instead of queer theory as an add-on or a chapter, right? And so that's why we landed on Bloomsbury, but I could totally see, and I'm less knowledgeable about European context, but I could totally see the Algonquin group or other, obviously the Harlem Renaissance, parts of the Harlem Renaissance had affinity groups too, that where we could look at how important conviviality is to artistic, philosophical, and let's just say cultural critique and creation, right? And so, there's no special, there's the special reason that we focus on Queer Bloomsbury is we were sort of frustrated with how it had been caricatured before, but I don't think that that could have been the only way it went. And certainly I think the approach could be used to sort of look at conviviality in other groups, and I hope they would be fruitful, right, and add to what we know rather than be a sort of competitive thing, because it's not a competition, it's a sort of generative idea.
So the book Queer Bloomsbury also deals with Bloomsbury bashing and sort of historical challenges to queer and feminist scholarship in the group. What are the sort of historical challenges to research on the topic?
Yeah, it's a good book to write. So, Eve Sedgwick's work is really important in this respect. She's got some nice things in the epistemology of the closet, which is, I think, a really important, the introduction is a really important piece of work to read, where she lists, like, I think 7 reasons why that, queer scholarship or scholarship on, let's say, non-heteronormative movements and people and ideas had been sort of pushed away. This was in the 90s. Remember, things are different now, but that, and they were sort of like, well, that can't be important. It's just private. And I was told that all the time. There was some my first year of grad school, we're talking about Siegfried Sassoon, Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, that's the American title. It's Siegfried's Journey is, I think, the trilogy that is the British title. But I remember thinking there was this moment where the young man in the memoir kept sort of not being able to see himself in a mirror, and it seemed like a motif in that memoir. And I just sort of naively, this is 1990, said, well, maybe it's because he's gay, and oh my God, that was like, I had said that I had like pissed the floor or something like that, so, and it was like, that's, I'm sorry I even brought that up, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, but actually that could nowadays, if we were to look at it, we'd be like, yeah, that not seeing oneself mirrored, if you're growing up in a kind of phobic environment, that makes perfect sense to be a motif in a memoir. And maybe, that maybe not the only thing that we see in that particular moment, but it certainly is something. But this idea that the personal lives are somehow, first of all, that being non-heterosexual is somehow, a personal thing only, and not also about the way we live our lives, that just sort of shut down a lot of attention to things that might be important. I mean, people write literary criticism about all sorts of things, like, Virginia Woolf's, father's profession, right? He was a biographer, right? Or that if you can write about that, then why can't you write about, the fact that, she had the hots for, Vita Sackville West or something like that, right? Why is that? So that was one of them, but other things are like, it's interesting, rarely do people leave, written, verifiable, non-destroyed, like, indestructibly, saved in the safe evidence of their, sexual, encounters, right? It's not like somebody's like saved as in the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky case, where Monica Lewinsky, saved a dress with sperm on it, right? We usually don't have that level of evidence. And so the idea that there's a sort of lack of evidence about somebody's sexual life means that they must have been straight, also something that Sedgwick looks at. And, that was really interesting for me and for Gail Polhouse when we looked at Wittgenstein, because there, it seemed like there was a lot of evidence that he was, he liked to go cruising in Prater Park in Vienna. And he, whether he had sex or not, I wasn't there in the room, and I don't have a, piece of underwear with somebody else's sperm on it, in Wittgenstein's collection, right? We don't have that level of forensic evidence, but, he certainly had some pretty, intimate male relationships where you're like, oh, that's, one of his young gentleman friends, went off and lived in Norway for months and months and months together in a little hut. And you're like, okay, maybe they're just, working on math together. They probably are, but also, is there a way in which we can think of them as, there's something intimate going on there, and so this idea that there's, if there's no evidence of, penetration of one body by the other body, that somehow that means it's, they didn't have sex, or that they weren't intimately or romantically connected, and therefore they must be straight. That's always the thing. That's just an example of a sort of heteronormative worldview that comes to think of the normal or the norm as always already straight. And we know that's not the case. Might not even be the case for most people, but still a lot of historical scholarship has gone along that lines. I think the other difficulty is, what do you do when somebody is sort of really cool, but then also, and you're like, wow, Gertrude Stein, I mean, she was pretty awesome, and she and Alice lived together, and they called each other wife, and Alice was Gertrude's wife. And you're like, wow, that's so really awesome that that's going on. But also they had some pretty shitty politics, or at least, Gertrude Stein did. I wouldn't necessarily agree with her if we had gotten together at a salon, for example, because she tended to be pretty conservative in many things, which doesn't mean that she wasn't who she was, which is a kind of, interesting, iconic figure of a non-feminine, lesbian in a long-term relationship and who was really out there with that. That was really important, but she also wasn't necessarily perfect in every way. And so that kind of idealization of people in the past can be something that we come across too, because, same thing with Woolf, she wasn't great about a lot of things. She had some really important insights, but also, she was a white English woman who was, living during a time of British imperialism, and, her attitudes sometimes replicated the sort of racist or, in some cases, ableist underpinnings of that political scene. Right. So the idea that finding somebody who happens to match an LGBT or Q, I'm searching for the right word, but let's just say, character profile, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to find that our politics or our ethics or our radical ideas for, a better future, more just, socially just future, are going to be replicated there too, because people are complicated, and also they're usually neither 100% awesome or 100% horrible. Although there's some people I prefer not to write about. Ezra Pound, for example, is just, I just, I'm sure some people might really like his work. That's the line I don't want to cross. So those are some of the issues, but also then I'll just hold it, I really want to stress that the definitional game of being like, who's a real this and who's a real that, I always want to ask, why are we doing that, right? If it is to open up and sort of be more generative about how we can live and who we can be, then I'm really excited about doing that. If it's about creating a definition that's excluding or setting up a new norm in the place of an old one, a new restrictive norm in the place of an old one, then I often think we have to look at that with some skepticism. I think that, so Yasmin, you're coming to us from Chicago, is that true? Yes, okay.
Yes, so sorry.
Yeah. Hi, yeah. I think a lot about this in terms of Kathy Cohen's work. I mentioned Chicago because she's at University of Chicago, and she has this really important piece called
Bulldogs,
Bulldaggers, Dykes, and Welfare Queen. Yeah,
Bulldogs.
and so and she talks about how there are some affinities that we politically that we've missed or have not fully embraced between the sort of heteronormative way in which, let's say, a gay person or white lesbian might be treated by the state or by biopower, and how the bodies of, let's say, single Black women with children of a certain social class, of a working class or working poor class, might there might be more political and social affinities between those two groups that we're missing on when it comes to collective action building than we think if we just think about in terms of identity, right? So it's either straight people or not straight people, or we're thinking about sexual identity or gender identity rather than what we do with that. So I think it's important there too to just sort of remember that what we're really sort of looking at is fighting against, I hope, this sort of toxic heteronormativity, toxic ableism, toxic state racism, scientific racism, and all of these things come from, I think, biopolitical formations of power that depend on defining us by the norm, right? By a certain kind of norm, which is restrictive. I got off on a loop there. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's brilliant. I'm going to ask a couple of questions that sort of come back to some things that Harvey was bringing up, really. G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica was a sort of huge philosophical influence on the Bloomsbury Group and Bloomsbury aesthetic theory, especially his assertion that personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments include all the greatest and by far the greatest goods we can imagine. So on the one hand, the text sort of values personal affections and aesthetic enjoyment, which would seem to chime with sort of Bloomsbury's own aesthetics and way of life. But it also seems, the text also seems potentially queer in another respect, in that it's sort of challenging the way that nature gets conflated with the good. This is especially relevant to kind of queer theory because queer lives are often charged with being unnatural and therefore morally condemnable. To what extent does Moore's writing offer themselves to a queer reading?
That's a great question. And I am going to say that the philosophers in the room probably are going to be able to answer it better than I can. I can't speak to Moore as well as other people can. I know Anne Banfield has done a wonderful work called the Phantom Table, and it's about the Cambridge influence of Cambridge philosophy, Virginia Woolf especially. But I think what you're saying makes sense, and I would go back to what I said earlier about like thinking about journalist questions. So the question would be, how so? I mean, insofar as Moore, if Moore is thinking through the natural in a particular way, insofar as if that gets us an avenue or tool to pick apart this association between heteronormativity and nature, right? Which is, heteronormativity does not exist in nature, right? That heteronormativity is a concept and a sort of social organizing system, but it's not like you can go and be like, here's a cell, or here's an organism, and this is where we find heteronormativity. It's definitely a social function. So and also COVID is a part of nature, but it's not necessarily, I don't think it's contributing necessarily to our flourishing. We might be flourishing because of our coping mechanisms have brought us together in a different way, but I prefer that. I wouldn't call it good, right? Just because it's part of nature. And so I think you've got an avenue there for thinking through those journalist questions: where, what, for whom, under what conditions can Moore's work be read as furthering queer thought, right? Or furthering anti-heteronormative thought, or giving us some purchase to rethink the heteronormative logic that makes it hard for some people to flourish, to live, even to make their lives, to quote Judith Butler, unlivable. We hopefully want to, through our work, our art, our theorizing, our practice, our daily ways of being, open up ways for life to be more livable for ourselves and for others, and not close them down, right? So that was a way of not answering your question about G.E. Moore, because I think others of you in the room probably know a lot more about G.E. Moore. And I know he was important. And I know a lot of the Bloomsbury folks, especially who went to Cambridge, were really incredibly moved by him. But, there's a book in there somewhere, or at least a nice article about queer G.E. Moore, and I can't wait to read it.
Thank you. That was a slightly throwing question, really, but I was kind of curious. Yeah. Here's what your thoughts were.
No, it's a good question. I just can't answer it. Yeah.
So one of the things that fascinates me about the Bloomsbury Group is that many of the key philosophical influences, or even their own key intellectuals, are not the people that sort of spring to mind when I think of aesthetic modernism or queer theory. So philosophers such as G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein are mainly seen as philosophers of ethics or language, and they're taught in a way that's quite often dry or disconnected from questions of avant-garde art or queer politics. And whilst John Maynard Keynes is largely seen as an economist, quite separate from questions of aesthetics and sexuality, one of the things I found really interesting in your Queer Bloomsbury book is the way that it challenged us to reassess some of this. So Bill Mayer essay on John Maynard Keynes returns to Keynes's involvement in the Bloomsbury Group, his aesthetic theory, and his theory of probability in order to recuperate an alternative Keynesianism that might have been constitutive of another modernity. That was a road not taken by Bretton Woods planners. Likewise, your co-authored piece on Wittgenstein explores Wittgenstein's sexuality, his connection with the group, and offers a queer reading of his philosophy of language. To what extent can such figures be read as either queer, avant-garde, or offering us a radical alternative to the modernity that actually happened?
Oh, wow, what a great question. The modernity that actually happened is the one that we're suffering from now, right? I think that's what you're getting at. And I think Bill Maurer's piece is just brilliant. I remember reading it many years before this anthology was created, and wanting to include it. And we had to, he was on a deanship at the time, and he was really working hard. So we had to sort of beg and plead with him to be able to reprint it. But I think what he's showing is two things, many things, but two things I want to focus on is that when we read things, from their outcomes, right? We were like, okay, we've got Bretton Woods, and then we've got this sort of economic theory, and therefore that must have been the way it always, it was meant to unfold. We forget about those other possibilities that were in the kind of in-between stages, in the sort of formation, let's say, of Keynes's thought. And your way of phrasing the question, Bradley, makes me think a lot about this. There's a interesting piece by I'm gonna forget his name. His last name is Levine, I believe, but it's on against apocalyptic thinking. Right. And so it's this idea that, when there's a catastrophe, maybe that's saying too much, thinking of this modernity as catastrophe, but we can go all Benjamin there, right? Walter Benjamin, and think of modernity as catastrophe, and just for the sake of argument. And when we think things back through the catastrophe, then, things seem to unfold as if they were inevitable. Right, rather than as if at any one moment things could have gone, in this direction or in that direction or in this direction. And I think that's important, because when we think things are inevitable, we forget all the moments where what we did or what the people who were involved did could have mattered. And it's important for us to remember that we matter, right? We matter right now. The things that we do now, we might not be able to foresee how they might matter to a different outcome than some future historian might be looking back and saying, how the fuck did they get this way? As somebody who lives in the United States, I'm often thinking history will come and judge my compatriots very harshly and justly for what happened in the last 4 years. But we also forget those moments of resistance, or those ways in which people got together to sort of work for a different outcome. So, for example, here in the U.S., Stacey Abrams, what would have happened had Stacey Abrams not decided to work on ending voter suppression in Georgia? The world would have been different, right? But it wasn't, because she moved there. So our sense of agency is actually tied to thinking about other possible outcomes in the in-between, right? In between what happened. And that's where I'm thinking about your question, and it's a matter of it's Bernstein is the name of the author, Michael Andre Bernstein. He calls it side shadowing, right? So something off to the side instead of foreshadowing. And I think what Maurer is doing is he's providing, an alternative. That what if we would have gone fully with, this other notion that Keynes was articulating, right? And I'm not an economist, so he's an anthropologist of money, which is interesting. But, it would be interesting to think about alternatives. For example, now to come back to today, what would happen if we didn't, in many parts of the world, think that neoliberalism was just a given fact, right? That it was inevitable, right? What if we did think that there could be another way of being together? And sometimes when you say that, you shock yourself out of, or you shock your colleagues out of thinking that, the system, the economic system that we're in, the political system that we're in, the social system apparatus that we're in, is just the way it is, right? So this idea, at least when I was coming up, of the idea that there will always be poor people among us. Who said that had to be? That's actually a moral or ethical framework, right? We could imagine a world where everyone had enough to eat. And it's not necessarily a fantasy or a kind of ideal. It could be a groundwork for how we operate things, but it would mean different things, right? So from that perspective, I think Maurer's piece is really interesting because he gives us a different Keynes, and it gives us a way to think about the importance of the aesthetic, of intimacy, of this sort of generative coming together or conviviality as something that could influence things that seem so separate, like political, negotiations or the economy. And yet that's how we might see it in hindsight, but that's not how it was experienced by Keynes, or by, anyone. We live our lives moving forward, and we view our lives moving backwards, and so, from retrospect. And so when we're moving forward, we're like doing things like, trying to find help, I don't know, purchasing a train ticket so we can get to the next interview or something like that, right? That's not going to necessarily be something that shows up in the sort of grand historical summation of our lives or of our work. So that's the Keynes piece. And then the Wittgenstein piece, I think our piece was looking at what philosophers called the later Wittgenstein and not the Tractatus Wittgenstein. So and how Wittgenstein saw philosophy as a kind of process of, I think he called it cure, right? I should say that I should look next door and bring Dr. Paul House in here to talk more about Wittgenstein. But we were reading him as in the philosophical investigations as, again, being in the verb, right, investigating. And he often worked through, these discussion sessions where people would get together and he would just sort of speak on a question, and then they would move on, not necessarily things that were written down. And then this idea that we're really sort of working through things that, could be obvious to ourselves. That might not be the right word, if we weren't just sort of fixated on something else. Right. And so I think Wittgenstein was interested in the idea of language as something that was simple, but we got caught up in these traps or fixations on certain ways things should be, and unable to then keep moving through our thought. Some of the philosophers in the room, you might be questioning my very simplistic sort of understanding of Wittgenstein, but the core here is that both Wittgenstein and Woolf were very interested in the moving on, continuing the process, and also we're very, what I would call, anti-foundational, right? So the idea is what is what you are doing, right? Not some kind of syllogism that you come up with and prove, right? So you have to keep doing in order to keep continuing on the path. And both Woolf and Woolf in some of her, mostly her essays I'm really interested in, or her sort of more philosophical nonfiction, but also Wittgenstein. But then when you think about queer theory as, a mode of doing and not as a kind of being, then you have the link between the anti-foundational and let's say the verb action of each of those things, both aesthetically in Woolf, or ethically in Woolf, and philosophically in Wittgenstein, and then in terms of non-normative undoing of restrictive identities in queer theory. And so all of those things are moving along together, and that's why we were interested in them, and also why we thought they kind of fit with Queer Bloomsbury, but they were giving a very new twist to some of the same usual suspects, kind of a curveball out there, but we thought that would be interesting to look at.
So in your book, The Value of Virginia Woolf, you explore Woolf in relation, Woolf's work in relation to concepts such as eudaimonia, incandescence, interdependence, civilization, and barbarism. The book seems to offer a reading of Woolf that, as a kind of ethical theorist. To what extent do you see Woolf as developing a kind of ethics in her novels and writing? And to what extent can this be seen as a kind of queer ethics?
So I do read Woolf as somebody who is an ethical thinker and theorist, and was concerned with the question of, how to live and what to do. Also these sort of the ordinary. She's very interested in the quotidian, or the ordinary. And you see that in the little things, like in, To the Lighthouse. How do you go back to a time in your past and reflect on that, and maybe individuate from that. That would be Lily Briscoe looking back on a very formative and important time of her life, but then also winding up being, having to both appreciate it and individuate from it, and come up with, her own, not just her own vision, but one thing that I found when researching for this book is this idea of a just vision, right? I think taking it from Iris Murdoch's notion of a just and loving vision, and the character is able to achieve that through Lily Briscoe. The character is able to achieve that through a kind of rapprochement with her, her resentment of Mr. Ramsay, the sort of big patriarch, the paterfamilias, and be able to be compassionate and see the kind of, the fragile humanity that he also witnessed. So that's one example of Woolf, bringing us through a kind of ethical journey, but she's not telling us what to do. Ideally, she's maybe bringing us through that journey. I think I've thought of her as somebody who engages in queer work, right? Because I think she is very much interrogating the norms of gender and sexuality, but also certain kinds of families. Are we good? I think I must have said something wrong, and the recording was.
I pressed something by mistake. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I think insofar as that she was really, if we think of queer theory as something that, or queer action or queer thought as something that is, really interested in sort of picking away the structures or the scaffolds for heteronormative, other kinds of biopolitically normative. So state racism, following Foucault, and ableism, creating this sort of normative ideal body, and then, or body, mind, and thinking that everything else is unworthy of thriving. Woolf really has sort of brought us a number of examples of ways in which that structure has cracks and flaws and sort of undermines itself. And then in that undermining, or in the sort of rubble of that, maybe we can build new things. And so that insofar as she's doing that, I think I would call her somebody who's engaging in queer work. I also think that she's not taking for granted that war is okay, right? I mean, she's very much against militarism and war and competition and the sort of elitist, exclusionary way in which the education system of her time was set up. And she's often thinking, well, we need to kind of explode this and build it up from scratch. And there's this interesting moment in Three Guineas, probably one of my favorite moments, where she's like, we need to burn the whole university system down. She ultimately says we can't do that because we still need it. It's still one of the ways in which women she was interested in women's education in this piece, ways in which women can, gain more economic agency, and with more economic agency then can have more of an impact on the ethical direction of England at the time. But she said we should build a sort of cheap college where we all get together, and we're not thinking about building big economies and huge structures, but we're really thinking about living well. Right. She says the best livers should be get together, and we can talk and we can practice the simple arts of conversation and cookery, and give each other access to our creative impulses. That's also something she thinks is really important to combating the kind of aggressive mindset that leads to things like fascism and war. Insofar as that, she's really interested in relationality and ways of being differently. I think as counters to really destructive political and social systems, she's really giving us some examples about ways to go forward to not think that the political status quo is inevitable, that wars and competition between nations warring with each other, classes warring with each other is inevitable. We could think of a different way. We have to be able to have the imagination and the will to do that. So insofar as that's true, I think of her as somebody who's doing queer work.
So in The Persistence of Modernism, you appeal to the ancient Greek concept of the metic, who in ancient Greece was officially designated as an outsider dependent on the goodwill of the citizen sponsor in order to remain within the polis. Later in the book, you say that it would be more accurate to describe queer persons as metics, resident aliens of a polis who are vulnerable to the prevailing whims of political power. Following this, you go on to explore the queer metic intimacies in the work of Virginia Woolf and Hanif Kureishi, in which in what respect can notions of queer metic and queer metic intimacies help us understand communities like the Bloomsbury Group or multicultural communities in Qureishi's novels.
So let me start with the idea of metic, because it still seems to hold some weight for me. And then we can also think about communities that are both sort of aligned with privilege, but on sufferance, right? Which is depending on the time and the geography and the winds of political power and the mores of a certain culture, those things can change. So it's not as if there's a perfect definition of what I'm thinking of as Semitic, but I noticed when I was this is a long time ago when I was writing The Persistence of Modernism that most of the modernist writers, in the literary sense, this would be early 20th century writers, were queer in some way, like were not straight. There were a few who were, but the interesting ones to me were not. Like Helt and Detloff described herself as the perfect bi. She identified as bisexual. Gertrude Stein was what we would call today a lesbian. Woolf was sapphic. Every time I put an identity label on there, I have to cross my fingers behind my back because that it doesn't quite stick. But the point is that there were a number of folks in who are writing interesting work in the early 20th century, especially the women modernist writers who, had access to privilege. Woolf is certainly one of them, HD as well. She's Hilda Doolittle. She's, from Pennsylvania, and her father was an astronomer at University of Pennsylvania, came out to England and then later Switzerland to write. And Stein, who was a Jewish American and then lived in Paris, and so who was, both privileged, but then certainly lived in precarious situation, especially during World War II, where she lived in France during the time of, the Vichy government. So we have these people who were, in some ways had access to the means of production. I had access to be able to write, in some cases enough economic well-being to be able to not be dependent on another person for their well-being, right? So Woolf writes famously about this in A Room of One's Own and in Three Guineas, where she's, when she says women must have 500 pounds a year in a room of their own, she's talking about having enough economic self-sufficiency not to be dependent on probably a father or a brother for a pittance to be able to live and survive, which means that you can't, contradict them when they say something patriarchal or otherwise fucked up, right? So the medic is somebody who, has a kind of maybe access to both some bit of privilege, right? But then access to what it means to be on the precipice of precarity, could be kicked out. What if you piss off your mentor, then you could be kicked out or disowned or, worse, imprisoned. At the time, homosexuality was illegal, in many places, England, for example. So there's a kind of generativity to that position that maybe can have a certain amount of sort of privilege, but then also empathy going the other way and understanding, so that you could then begin to articulate, what's oppressive about belonging, but then also what is something more of the perspective of an outsider within a culture where you have the means to get your voice out there or your art out there. So that was sort of what I was thinking about in terms of the metic. And I definitely think, most of the Bloomsbury folks were queer or women or, situated non-dominantly in some way, but then also they were sort of incredibly privileged, right? So it's a balance between the two. And rather than thinking privilege, yes or no, I was really thinking about belonging and not belonging at the same time, and what kind of insights could be gained from that kind of maybe dual consciousness. I'm not sure I answered your question, but please just re-ask it. I'll try again.
That sort of was the groundwork. Yeah, so I was just sort of asking how the last question was, in what respect notions of queermetic and queermetic intimacies help us understand communities like the Bloomsbury.
Oh, and Qureshi, that's it. Yeah. Okay. So I'm really interested in Qureshi's work, especially work in the 90s and the early 2000s, but he's very interested in conviviality. I was thinking about, let's say, a film like Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, I quite love, or the Black Album, The Buddha of Suburbia, where Qureshi is looking at what it's like to be, English, but also considered not English because he has South Asian heritage, right? And deals with the racism that he experienced as a child in England at the time, but also has access to, not just education, but some financial stability and the means to engage in sort of quote unquote liberal conversation. Right? So there's these tensions in his novels between a kind of nationalist view, right, and then a kind of racist or homophobic view, and then this person who is in the nationalist, meaning, let's say, a Black nationalist view, or a sort of radical. This is before 2001, so a sort of radical Muslim or identity-based, nation-based group that would reject, things like sexual promiscuity or interracial sex and things like that. So he's sort of thinking about the tension between one group, which has really legitimate, important claims to, challenging the racist structures in which they're growing up in England, but then, might be problematic because also, let's say somebody who is queer or somebody who is non-normative, might find themselves, to not fit whatever was sort of normative in the nationalist view. But then also these folks who are self-described sort of liberals, not understanding that their sort of liberal, sense of freedom has been built up on an edifice of imperialism and racism, if that makes sense. And so we've got these characters who are between, who might be queer or otherwise non-normative, artistically, aesthetically adventuresome, not conservative in terms of a cultural understanding of who they are caught in between and have to navigate a way of thriving without being torn apart, right? And so that medic there then comes to be somebody who, because they have to negotiate these two different worlds, winds up having insight into both and into, what's important to remember from each group, right? It's important to remember the imperial underpinnings of sort of white liberal culture in London at the time, and the ways in which there might be people who face secondary marginalizations within communities of color because they're queer or because they're non-normative in some ways. So Qureshi does a really good job, I think, in, let's say, something like Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, of showing how important communities are. And there's a couple communities of people who gather together and they have fights and discussions and they hash things out, who have more generative conversations about all these tensions because they are together, they're thrown together, than necessarily somebody who maybe has read all the theory and is sitting at university, and among them being looking at these tensions from, let's say, a position already knowing and believing that their ideological position is pure and right. That's a bit of a simplification of what's going on, but I think, when we get together across our differences and hash it out rather than sort of pontificate at each other, then we get a more complicated conversation, in some cases a more difficult and painful conversation, but we might actually get somewhere. And I think that's kind of what Qureshi is doing in those novels and those films. They're always thought-provoking and controversial, but he's doing it for a reason. It's like to get us to fucking think and to react. But I think in the best instance to do that together so that we can get somewhere rather than just sort of lay down an ideal situation and then have us just feel that we are sort of morally or ethically superior, because we agree with the superior position being presented or whatever. That's a caricature a little bit, but I think that's kind of what Qureshi is doing through his gatherings, his descriptions of gatherings across difference. And it's an interesting model, and I think it's generative for ways of moving forward that would involve having hard and painful conversations with each other.
Almost like the Bloomsbury have this one kind of conviviality, and there's a much more very complex conviviality emerging.
Yeah. I mean, you're living together. So I should have clarified, conviviality isn't always nice, I mean, you've sat together at a table with people and you're like, fuck you, I mean, you can be mad at each other or disagree. And I think the idea is that you're still together around the table. And that's the important thing. And I think that's important too, in sort of Paul Gilroy's understanding of conviviality in a post-imperial context. And, it's also, if you look back at, theorists of the urban, like Jane Addams, I don't know if you're familiar with, this is from the 1960 or so, The Life and Death of the American City. She really talks about how in a city where people are together, you would think that there's a lot of people who think that cities are like, dangerous or, there's a lot of tension or something like that. But because people are thrown together, they're actually safer. People take care of each other. There's more of a communal or neighborhood feeling than there is in places like the suburb where, everyone has their fences, but also they tend to be segregated. We can really think about what it means to live together and to be together in a messy sort of way that actually is more forward-moving and more progressive, although messy, than these kinds of segregated ways of living. And I can only speak for the United States, but it's still a very segregated place. I mean, there are very few communities where communities of color are together. There's a go for it.
Yeah. I'm gonna unmute mine. So I guess this is a question, or maybe it's like a discussion thing, I'm not really sure, but I don't know anything about Bloomsbury Group or anything, so I'm like totally fresh to this right now. But I had like a bit of an epiphany listening to you and thinking about it, and as you do, having thoughts, being in the past, future, and all that kind of stuff, and trying to be in the present moment. But what I'm starting to think is like, maybe this whole thing of like the having to marry an opposite gender and have children and live in like a tiny, smallest version of a community in a tiny room, house as like one small thing is society and capitalism almost trying to separate big community, because that's the way that we heal and grow and really are ourselves, isn't it? Through other people. The more people you are, the more you are of yourself, because you aren't just being just yourself in your mind and one other person's mind, because you can't just learn yourself with one person, can you? I mean, I can't. I just wonder if like Disney and everything and all these societal things are just, they're trying to stop us from being what it used to be way back in the past, like way before my ancestors can even remember in my dreams that I had it, where people used to live together and people used to have like period circles and all that kind of thing, where we used to look after each other, look after children together. When now it's like, you're being shown on television that you're meant to have a child and struggle and hate your life and potentially like kill your partner in your sleep or divorce them, or whatever hell is happening in society now. So then everyone's terrified and doesn't know who or what they are, and actually we shouldn't just be able to be anything but all together. I don't know where this is coming from. I basically had one drink, so now I'm like, oh my god, Disney is fucking us over. But also like, what, it just sounds like this is what we should all be, right? And I want to know as well, specifically are there any things that you've taken from it, or you practice, or you believe what we should be practicing to kind of help create this?
Yeah, my work is done here. I'm just going to say my work is done here. You got the message. You got the brief. Heteronormativity is fucking us all over, even the heterosexuals. And, you know, we need to stop it. It's not necessarily because of sex, although, you know, it can be because of that, but because of the social order that follows from that. Go ahead, go.
Because you just said, like, sex is another thing that they're trying to distract us with. The whole point, isn't it? Like, it shouldn't be about sex, connectivity, art, and whatever. Like, it is part of it. But like the whole fact that I can't even walk down the street with my top off if I'm hot because the boob is going to distract someone to come on me or some shit. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like sex has become like a negative thing, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah. No, it shouldn't be. It should also maybe not just be the savior, right? You know, I mean, for some people, it's just fun, you know? What the fuck? Why can't it just be fun? Or, you know, for some people, it's not, and that's okay too. But the point is, it's become, this is the Foucauldian point, it's become really linked to some sort of deep foundational part of ourselves. Maybe it could be something fun that we do, you know, and it doesn't have to have this sort of significance linked to morals, family, religion, nation, and all these things. There's a lot that hinges on sex in the current heteronormative worldview, or at least the one that permeates here, and I think also across the Atlantic. And I think, yes, I think what queer theory does, and what, you know, also CRIP theory, critical disability theory, and I think certain kinds of anti-racist, anti-imperialist theory do is try to, instead of focus on the people who have been in some ways defined or limited or constrained or even sort of created by, you know, as identities by these social forces, that we go back and we say, you know, these social forces are not really conducive to our flourishing and thriving together. They're part of the problem, and we should, you know, not take them so seriously, right? But I do think that would necessitate, and you asked a practical question, I hope I get it right, you know, and it's different coming from the US, because some things that are just obvious to every other person, you know, every other culture in the world, are not obvious to the US, like, you know, having, you know, access to healthcare. I mean, that is a big, that, like, you have to be either employed in a certain kind of job that most people can't get into, you know, or get your health care through, you know, things like marriage to one person, right? And so then if you don't have access to marriage, or let's say you just don't fucking want to get married, then, you know, you're in trouble, because if you get cancer and you don't have health insurance, you're fucked. So I think, you know, paying more attention to the things that we all need in order to flourish, that we really need, and not that we are told are important in a kind of timeline of our life. So birth, performing a certain role as a boy or a girl, nothing in between, having that get coded onto our desires for other people who are coded as a boy or a girl, nothing in between, you know, and then not deviating from that. And then, you know, that sort of just brings us right into a desire to have a certain kind of comportment, and that supposedly has, you know, gets us into a desire to have a certain kind of, you know, relationship, and that makes us want to produce, even though, you know, reproduction is probably, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of people happier. Some people might be happy, you know, creating another person and creating a community. But some people, for women especially, people who are gender assigned women, you know, there's a lot of pressure that somehow you're kind of broken, you know, if you don't want to reproduce, or you're broken if you don't want to be in a long-term monogamous relationship with one other person and, you know, build a house with them, right? So all of these things, that's what I mean by the logic of heteronormative logic of cultural intelligibility, is that you're somehow broken or off or abnormal if, you know, you don't want all these things. But then also if you don't do these things, or you make a change in the middle, that you've failed, right? They don't map one-to-one onto our flourishing or even our happiness in a sort of deep sense of of the word, not in the terms of, consumer satisfaction sense of the word. So the question then is, what do we need in order to flourish? And, it might be that we need each other, but it might not be that we need to find Mr. or Ms. or person right and get down in a romantic relationship with them and live happily ever after, and they never die and they never cheat on you and they never, become sick. And there's so many contingencies even to the quote unquote perfect story that make it impossible for us to rely on that for all of our lives, to carry us through and help us thrive, because chances are there are going to be times when we're not in a traditional family and we're not partnered, even if we're inclined to have that way, right? And chances are that there are a lot of people who don't even want that, and for whom that would be the most excruciating kind of, claustrophobia, to be stuck in that family situation. Sarah Ahmed is really good about that in Queer Phenomenology, if you're interested in how these heteronormative structures that are sort of like, I just want you to be happy and I just want you to meet person right and get together and have a family, that those things can be, that can press in on you, and they can, I'm thinking of like, a mold that sort of presses you and tries to form you in a certain way, where if you resist that molding, you can be in for a lot of pain, right? Because you're getting squished in a way that you don't want to go, and you're being asked to conform to a shape that doesn't work for you. So that is all a way of saying, yeah, you're totally right. And we need to just ask ourselves, what are the conditions under which we create a world where we can thrive without the map that we are given by heteronormative society.
And I wanted to know what you do. Is there anything that you do or practice, or the way that you live your life that maybe would be like helpful, I don't know, to take?
No, I don't think my life personally is like the best example. I mean, I think what I do most is I teach, and I try to create the conditions of possibility for my students, to question the painfully conformist world that we are given, and to find other ways to live. And so insofar as I'm trying to do that, that's probably my greatest contribution. But also, as Virginia Woolf said, thinking is my fighting. And so I'm a theorist or a cultural critic by trade. And so what I try to do is I see this foundation before me and I see the cracks in the foundation. And so sometimes I just need to, throw a spanner into that and just wiggle it a little more and open up the cracks so that we can start making more room for ourselves in that. And I do that mostly by my thinking and writing and teaching. And by my friend communities. I have a sort of friend community as well. We've, I think, kept each other alive over the course of the pandemic. And I think I know I'm not the only one who has that. And maybe what we can do is learn from that, and carry it forward as a better model than the whole like find person right and like swear undying love to them forever and ever, even though it's a very unrealistic goal, even for someone who's inclined that way. If we have a soulmate, go ahead, Yo.
I'll say one more thing. Hearing you say that now is making me realise, because I don't think I want children, just because I feel like what we do as human beings, we're all like, we have mother roles, father roles, brother, sister roles to everyone that we meet along the way. And like, I kind of had some children, I'm sure I'll have some more. And maybe I'll have one, I don't know. But I feel like we do have that. Like, I feel like I've been a mother like a few times, and I probably will some more. And I wouldn't say that it would be any more of my child if I gave birth to that child. But maybe that's because I have a mum that never cut the umbilical cord, so I'm terrified of mimicking that again. So who knows? But I do believe that we do have those roles, don't we? We have those loves and things. And listening to you say that, you have your family, and we all have our families and our friendships that create that community that's what we should have. And society isn't on our side for that being a good thing. I've just moved into like a guardianship, so I live with 40 people. We all look after each other, and we're all so different. But there are like children there are like pets who behave like pets sometimes. You have to pick up their shit. You take them for a walk, you feed them, you know, kind of like, we kind of have those roles, but it gives you purpose. And isn't that like almost what life is? If you give and take and there's purpose. Like, we're not being taught by society that is enough sometimes. Like, being part of like a community can be enough. And creating is just the product of happiness or sadness. But yeah, I'm not going to stop talking about this. But yeah, thank you. I feel like you have opened my eyes to a little part of me that I knew was there, but I didn't.
Oh, good. I think I should log off now because my work is done. I feel
I would really love to know whether your book Queer Bloomsbury was sold in the Charleston Farmhouse shop.
I think it was. We had a good, I'm not sure though, because I didn't get over there, but one of the contributors was curator at Charleston. And so it was Darren Clark.
Okay, he's of course, the thing that worries me at the moment, I went to see the Nina Hammett exhibition at wonderful woman. I'm in love with Nina Hammett.
Mm-hmm.
The exhibition was fantastic. I went to the gift shop and there were two books they conspicuously weren't stocking. One is the life of Patrick Nelson, Duncan Grant's long-term bisexual lover and artist. The life of Stephen Tommy Tomlin, a very tortured bisexual man, quite a sad tale. He's been written up now, but is the book there in the shop? No. They have a horrible history at Charleston of decaying just because they're so afraid of what their nice little straight white ladies are going to find when they come to the place. They don't want too much queerness. They just want a little frisson. Let's go and buy a bohemian frisson. Yes, I love it there. Bloomsbury. Look at me, I put a Bloomsbury scarf on. Bollocks, what bollocks? Thing, look, watch.
Yeah, no, I totally hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I'll find out. And I'm going to go talk to the University of Edinburgh and see if the press and see, make sure that we get some books out there. I've been known to, just supply books to institutions that need them too. So I do think that's one of the issues of in terms of creative and artistic and scholarly work is that there's a lot of deracination, de-gaying, also sort of not really paying attention to people's neuroaffective atypicalities, right? So the fact that not everyone is, someone like Virginia Woolf, most likely had bipolar.
Is a ground surge of people who are fascinated by Black Bloomsbury. And that's so heartening. It's been such a pale-faced white location so long.
Yeah.
Ever since the trust took it over, really. That's not its history. It has an amazing Black history, that place. But why don't we hear more about it? Why is that not central at the fore?
That's a good question. I didn't hear every single thing about that, but I think you're absolutely right there. Was that a specific question about Queer Bloomsbury, or just like why the fuck is everything so different? Which I agree with. Yeah, I totally agree. And there's an interesting scholar who's doing work on Asian and South Asian influences or folks in Bloomsbury too. I'm just forgetting her name right now. I will find it. She gave a talk at the Virginia Woolf conference when it was at University of Reading. And I just have, so I don't know if this COVID or not, but I don't often remember names well. And so I have to go and look them up, but I will look her up and I will send that information to Bradley so that you all have it, but she's really important. And I think that's just sort of what we need to do is stop. We need to actually see what's there on the ground, including each other, rather than sort of create an ideal and then populate it with the people who fit our ideal, which is kind of what you were saying about the bookshop too, right?
So I'm tying these threads together, and I think there's also something about having Yo present that makes this kind of group a little bit more therapeutic than it sometimes is. At the weekend, I got punched in the face, and it was because for me this ties in very much to a couple of ideas that you were talking about. So one was the idea of what it means like to be in a cosmopolitan city, and conviviality not always being something which is positive. And also what you were saying about how our modern world, for whatever reason, forces us into a very kind of narrow understanding of what it means for a community unit to be, being something really basic of man, woman, even if you can extend that to say that, okay, woman, woman, man, 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 or, different binary. But I think that trying to sort of reflect on that critically, what happened in that moment was I had a go at this guy for sort of treating his girlfriend badly when we were walking home from a party, and then he didn't really know how to deal with being confronted because he was so used to that unit being the only unit that he understood that he reacted to it in a violent way, and as soon as he did it, he regretted it. But it opened up this thing, and I think that maybe it's difficult to even describe it as a kind of flourishing, but it opened it up to Katie and Francesca, two of the people that are here tonight, being able to talk to the girl openly in a way that perhaps wouldn't have happened. And I was able to say to the guy, now you've punched me, can you now talk to me about how you've acted, And like, even if it was a very tragic environment about this guy being very abusive to his girlfriend, that point about the extensive community really sort of comes to the fore. And I think it scares people. It's not necessarily a flourishing, but it is something which is so painful that it creates a shock. And that shock can be something which is violent, but it enables something new to kind of come about.
That is such a beautiful example. I mean, painful, and I'm sorry that you were hit, which is unacceptable, but also it sounds like you all managed to create some conditions of possibility out of that experience of connectivity, right?
Yeah, so, generative.
I feel like your eyes going to heal before you know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, seriously, this is what as soon as I got hit, I didn't care. I knew that I was bleeding a little bit, and I was like, no, it doesn't matter. But your relationship carries on.
He's like bruised to do that to a human being.
Me and Francesca were talking about it a little bit afterwards. The way that this person could have almost like this mask and this smokescreen to act that violent and immediately react with such empathy. Okay, he didn't have the words to describe himself, and he didn't have the words, and he didn't have the sort of like presence of mind to start critiquing his relationship and exactly why I would have called him out on that. But the fact that he hurt somebody really moved him. And I think that you're completely right. It's something that he's probably thought about more than me. I feel it when I scratch my arm.
How important it is for people who are in a similarly privileged position to call out other people. And I'm not making any assumptions, but from your name and in your presentation, you come across as a masculine embodied person telling another masculine embodied person, hey, this is not okay. And that's that kind of solidarity with somebody who's an feminine embodied person who is being abused by toxic masculinity. I think that's where it's all at, right? Maybe that gets back to the position of the metic, right? To say, you're in a position of you're differently privileged in that relation and then able to make a difference. And that is so crucial.
Yes, Katie, yeah, hello. So it's just a thought that came to me, and I made a little note about something that I am taking away from this conversation is how heteronormativity can be just as damaging and is sometimes synonymous with the patriarchy. It might be an obvious thing, but it's something that can still be permeated through feminist theory. Which is what your thoughts might be on that, whether you agree or disagree.
And I just see that I got it right. So patriarchal thinking can be just as fucked up as patriarchy, and that can be permeating through feminist theory. Did I get that right?
Yeah, like some feminist thoughts.
Oh yeah.
Heteronormativity within it.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's where that identity policing is really messed up. I'll just say it, the whole TERF stuff is just totally wrongheaded, and I hesitate to even call it that, call it feminist. But that whole thing has been really disheartening to me, because people who call themselves feminists who are transphobic, and say all this sort of transphobic stuff in the name of protecting women, and it's not causing cis women to flourish more. It's actually just creating a yet another category that needs to be policed, and yet another sort of category of belonging or exclusion. And I think that insofar as that kind of thinking is going on, it's problematic no matter what the person calls themselves and whether they call themselves a feminist or not. And that happens not just in feminist political action, but also in other sort of political groups. But the point is creating this kind of, special chosen in group, and then this sort of dangerous group of others who shouldn't have the same access to flourishing. I mean, that's the problem. And it just so happens that cis hetero patriarchy, it tends to accrue privilege to white men who are straight and gendered. But that doesn't mean that kind of logic and thinking can't be perpetuated by others, and I think that's what I got from your comment, Katie, and I totally agree with you. And so that's also why the journalist questions who, why, what, where, for whom, under what conditions does this apply are so much more helpful than just saying, is she a woman or is she not? Why is somebody asking that question? I think that for what reason and for whom. I'm not sure that's getting to everything that you're saying, but that's one example of the kind of exclusionary identitarian thinking that it's not helping anyone thrive, and therefore I think it's problematic. It's terribly problematic, and I would like to sort of live in a world where we helped each other as to the things that we need to flourish and to have a livable life. And insofar as that we're not doing that, then we're part of the problem.
Hey, I'm Sash.
Hi, Sash.
Hey, I've been thinking a lot about how this talk of flourishing and how do we manifest that now in a time where we are literally terrified of each other, and not just because of COVID, but in the sense that we have young people only finding it safe to communicate by sitting alone on their sofas and scrolling on their phones and creating their identity through this very individualist manner of being expressive that is separate from other people. It feels to me that there has never been more limitations to that kind of collective flourishing than there is now. And even, I've struggled with this. I'm someone who now lives alone, and in some ways I do flourish from being alone. I think the intensity of the problems it feels that there are being in a community or a collective space, there is always this part of me that feels drawn to creating that kind of community again, and did many, many years ago create a community that I entirely based on the Bloomsbury Group. It's mainly based, it mainly had academics and poets meeting and writing and sharing and writing together. It feels difficult now to manifest that more than ever. So I just wondered if you had any inspiration from your sheer knowledge on this topic.
If I had the answer to that, I would immediately implement it, and because this is the question. So the first thing is to say, start from that question, right? What do we need in order to help each other thrive and flourish? I do think that maybe what we can do is look at, I work on culture and, I study written word and I'm interested in the kinds of messages we put out. And so one, we need to intervene in the kinds of messages that are proliferating through all sorts of avenues of culture, social media, family structures and institutions, education, the news media, and there's been a lot of amplification of discourse that says we should be afraid of each other and that we should hate each other, right? I think that has links to certain formations that we could recognize as fascist, at least in the United States. It's not just an analogy or a kind of bad word that we're throwing at what happened under Trump, for example, and it's still going on, and that is quite frightening. And there are real violences that come of that, and people suffer in psychological, economic, but also physical ways because of that. And so one of the things that we can do is use our access to creating culture, creating a counter narrative, creating tools, dismantling these oppressive and hate mongering messages, so that we can come up with at least the indication that there is a possible other way. Right. And so that is why things like art and literature and music and other forms of, embodied culture, dance, getting together at the bar over, to talk about ideas. That's important. It's not the only answer, and it's certainly not going to do it all on itself. But at the very least, we should be countering these kinds of messages that tell us that one group is out to destroy the other group, and that if you admit, for example, that Black Lives Matter, that somehow, that's going to destroy all of the social fabric of the United States, at least. We know that is not true, but it's being, that kind of messaging is being propagated from so many different venues that we have to keep standing up against that message to show people there's another way. And it works sometimes, right? I mean, it does work. In my own experience, it often works through one-on-one or through small group interaction with a small community or a neighbor, rather than it does through a sort of loudspeaker platform. Although that's important too, right? My platform right now is simply where I am as somebody who teaches at university. So I would not discount the important power of, art and culture to change the discourse. I don't think it's everything, but it's something, and everyone needs to do a little something in order for the culture to shift. And here's something that's interesting that I've thought of. You know how a sand dune works, where it's in a certain shape, right? Then if you were to have all the time in the world to drop like a grain of sand on it at a time, eventually there would be enough sand on it to shift it. The sand dune would, change shape, and it would, become another dune and stuff like that. But the point is, you're like, what the fuck can I do? I'm only this little fucking grain of sand. There's no way I'm going to move that whole sand dune. But the point is, if there are enough grains of sand putting their, dropping their grain onto the whole edifice, we can move it. It will move. It is a mathematical or scientific, certainty, but we just gotta believe that we should be dropping grains of sand. Even if we don't see the difference, it does make a difference. Right. That's my pep talk, but also I believe it to be true. I believe it to be true, but I also, it's pretty hard. It's the long game. It's the game that started before we were born, and will go on after we're not here anymore. Being in the movement that matters, because we have no other option than to, because what else would we do? I have a piece, and I'll send it to you if you're interested. It's called Strong Armed Sisyphe, and it's the feminine ending for Sisyphus. It's an online piece, so I'll try to find it. It's in the inaugural Journal of Feminist Modernist Studies, and I wrote it at a time where I was at my wit's end, and I was severely depressed because it was 2017. It was right after in the United States, and it just felt like, why am I writing a piece on literary modernism when, the world is fucking coming to an end because we have this. Sorry, this is recorded. We have this person doing a lot of danger. I was going to say something a little more vicious, but
Do it.
yeah, I did say in this piece, and we're living under the shadow of fascism. Just thinking about how it feels to be part of long, sort of lineage of people who, you feel like you're pushing the rock up the hill, right? The way Sisyphus does it. And, in Camus' work on Sisyphus, that's the sort of existential freedom is sort of being happy with the rolling the rock up the hill. Sisyphus is happy. And I was kind of angry. And so I just said, well, actually, Sisyphe, the feminine version of Sisyphus, is not happy. She is pissed, But the thing to remember is that rolling a fucking rock up the hill over and over and over again and have it come crashing down nearly, to destroy the things that you find near and dear and love, gives you really strong arms, right? Strong arms to stay. And I know so many cultural workers, so many people who, especially women, queer people of color, who have been rolling this fucking rock up the hill so often is that they do it with one hand while they're doing all the rest of their work, right? And it gives you strong arms. So that's one thing to take away from it. I recognize this territory. We're rolling the rock up the hill, but I can do it. Two, I'm not going to not do it. You better be careful because I'm pretty strong now from the work of doing that. Put our strong arms together, and maybe we'll get the fucking rock over the hill.
Okay, so I feel like I'm going back into something more theoretical for a second. So in the persistence of modernism, you tell us that Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway contains seeds of a critique of biopower. How do you understand the concept of biopower, and how do you see it emerging in Virginia Woolf's work?
The early 20th century is a time when there is a shift from, in my view, thinking about the rule of, law, rules, even to being sort of self-disciplined by norms, right? Which is why heteronormativity is so problematic, among other things. But the better answer is in the piece, the written piece, because I was able to it took a long time to sort of sort it all out. Let's say this. One of the things biopower works by is through capitalizing on the certain notion of the norm or the normal as a good, as an ideal. So we've gone from thinking about there's a whole variety of people who are different from each other. Maybe statistically, the statistical norm of people are so tall or so wide or complicated, so intelligent, right? Because this is also the time of eugenics where researchers are, trying to look at how smart people are, how capable people are. That has a strong tie to scientific racism and to ableism and also to certain kinds of sexism, right? Thinking that like men's brains are bigger, they must be smarter. All that stuff is counted scientifically, but what remains of a lot of that is this notion that somehow to be normal, quote unquote normal, is to be good, and that to be normal has to do with a certain kind of path of development, right? Both sexually, but also intellectually and psychologically. And so what I've been interested in is how we can think of through CRIP theory, which is sort of critical disability studies that takes into account how biopower works, and is sort of akin to queer theory, but is looking more at ableism and normative ableism than it is about sexuality. But they're coming from some of the same intellectual places and just have different. Every time I'm crossing my fingers because there's a lot of overlap, but I have different emphasis, just slightly different emphasis, and the same thing in critiques of scientific racism. So what we have is this notion that that there's the sort of normative, turns out to be white, turns out to be heterosexual, turns out to be mostly male, a feminine female, sort of be a partner to that. Groups that those are sort of the norm, and then everyone else is abnormal in some way, right? And that society should be organized around the needs of and the desires of and the inclinations of the quote unquote norm, and that the other folks are at best people who should not count towards the way, should not be considered in society best serve the needs of the people, or at worst are conceived of as threats to the normal operation of society, right? So it's threats to the well-being, the privileged group. Woolf is doing in Mrs. Dalloway, it's been a while since I thought this through, is, she's got two characters who are, neuroaffectively Smith, who is a shell-shocked veteran, of one who is, he's having some serious post-traumatic stress reactions to his time as a soldier in World War I, and is treated abysmally by the psychiatric institutions, who basically say, these are their doctors who basically say he's not being a man, right? He's not being man enough to, move on from his traumatic time in the trenches. But then we also have a character, Mrs. Dalloway, who is seen too as, not 100% normative, not 100% sort of well, right? And there are other characters in there too, but I would say that through the depiction of how viciously policing the psychiatric institutions are toward somebody who is, nomenclature is important here, but is perceived to have, to be sort of abnormal or have a mental illness. What Woolf is showing is how viciously normative those things can be, and how those things, judgments about people who are neuroaffectively atypical, who might experiencing what we would call today post-traumatic situation or another kind of mental illness. But in any case, she's showing how, how that works. And in that sense, she's showing us how biopower works or can work through the institution, the violent imposition of a norm onto somebody. So that's one way I think she's working to take biopower. So when I wrote that book, which is the early 2000s, I was thinking about how some people say, the 20th century started and ended in Sarajevo. I think that comes from an essay by Susan Sontag, but she was probably quoting somebody. But what we're seeing is, in my opinion, the rise of fascism, not neo-fascism, just like flat out fascism and state racism, and an attempt to sort of impose quote unquote strictures on people, quote unquote traditional family values and such. And that has such a resonance for me with what I read about in the 1930s. Obviously there are differences, there are contextual differences, but ideologically, it's quite disturbing to see that one way, at least in the US, populism has gravitated towards scapegoating, non-dominantly situated people of color in the United States, people of South Asian, Middle Eastern descent, but also from Latin America, African. It's unsettling to think that, here we go again. One way to look at it, and I'm just improvising here, is to also think, what were the strategies that people who are writing under the 20th century version of fascism used to resist fascism in their day, or colonialism and imperialism in their country? What are the strategies that we can learn from so that we can, mount our own resistance? I think I was thinking about the idea of the modernist patch also, is like when we look at a certain time in history before us, even like, let's say 2001, which is history to us now, viewing of it, it's not just that we sort of correct the way people viewed it in 2002 or something like that, but own perspective. Also,
well, I think you keep cutting out a little bit.
Okay, all right. What if I were? It's fucking scary what's going on. And that should call our attention to what was problematic then. And we should come back and we should use some of the strategies that people used to resist in 1930s and 1940s to try and do better in the 2020s and 2030s. Right? If it's imperative that we learn from that and we take what we can to resist what's happening now. It does seem very frighteningly.
Thank you so much for this. Yeah, I think our sound has all gone a bit haywire just towards the end, so I think maybe we'll sort of wrap it up.
That's great.
But thank you so much for doing this. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and do be in touch.
Yeah.
And I'll try to link back to your website and your salon, because I'm really excited by what you're doing.
Oh, thank you.
You make me feel happy about future to come, because you're doing things that are important and good. Thank you for what you're doing, for inviting me. I look forward to sort of continuing to be in touch. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for just sharing your work with us, and it's been just really great to just hear you talk with us. It's been brilliant.
Back at you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud, Twitter or Facebook. Exploding Appendix, Ideas and Culture with